incline our hearts to understanding. We cry out for insight and raise our voices for understanding. Surely, if we seek it like silver and search for it as treasure, we will find the knowledge of God. Amen. Our reading for today comes from the second chapter of the book of Hebrews, way towards the end. It's a fascinating little letter. We'll talk about it a bit, but I am going to focus on 10 through 18 of chapter 2. So, it was fitting that God, for whom and through whom all things exist, in bringing many children to glory, should make the pioneer of their salvation perfect through sufferings. For the one who sanctifies and those who are sanctified all have one Father. For this reason, Jesus is not ashamed to call them brothers and sisters, saying, I will proclaim your name to my brothers and sisters. In the midst of the congregation, I will praise you. And again, I will put my trust in him. And again, here am I and the children whom God has given me. Since therefore the children share flesh and blood, he himself likewise shared the same things, so that through death he might destroy the one who has the power of death, that is, the devil, and free those who all their lives were held in slavery by the fear of death. For it is clear that he did not come to help angels, but the descendants of Abraham. Therefore, he had to become like his brothers and sisters in every respect, so that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest in the service of God, to make a sacrifice of atonement for the sins of the people. Because he himself was tested by what he suffered, he is able to help those who are being tested. Having been doing this for a while here and coming back, when I look at the readings, I want to pick ones I haven't done before. And I decided, looking at this text for last week, that Hebrews would be the way to go, because it's one that I don't tend to talk about a whole lot. And that's a struggle that I myself have, but it's still important to kind of assess and address what's going on in here. And I don't want to say that like it's a terrible text and you shouldn't read it. There are other things to be much more wary of than Hebrews. But it's a text I like to argue with and about, because in a lot of ways it's more of a sermon that someone tacked an intro and like a greetings and a send-off to than it is anything else like what we see in Scripture. It's not a story like the Gospels, and it's not a letter like Paul's letters where they're clearly looking to address some specific concern somewhere. It's very abstract, and it goes through a lot of complicated theological principles in really rapid succession. So it's messy, and I'm sometimes unsure what to do with it. But we're going to talk about something we can do with it. Just as a little bit of background, Hebrews is probably one of the later components of the New Testament. It's certainly written after Paul. Most of the time it's tied to like the last quarter of the first century, so probably after the destruction of the temple of Jerusalem by the Romans, but before 100, give or take. So in the same time period that we're getting things like the Gospels being written, we get texts sort of like this. And there's a lot of theories on who wrote it, because whoever wrote it did not specify their name. It's not like Paul, who is very clear about who's writing Paul's letters. I, Paul, am writing this to you with my own hand, because that's really important to him to establish who he is. And the Gospels are all anonymous, but because they're there's stories. It's not necessarily as much of a concern. We tacked names onto them later. Hebrews, they never even tacked a name onto because it's so kind of unclear where it's coming from. There's some context clues saying this might be some of like Paul's buddies. When I preached about the end of Romans and there's that long list of names, it could be one of those people. In fact, there's a decent number, certainly not a majority, but a decent number that want to attribute this to Priscilla. She and her husband are listed in the end of Romans there as being major missionaries like Paul. But we don't know. Not that it's super critical to know, but I always think it's interesting to consider who's penning something. And then we get to the things that I think are particularly interesting whenever I read Hebrews, and part of why I struggle with it. The author is quoting multiple Old Testament texts, right? If you look at it, it's usually set aside, but there is at least 3 different quotations that they use. And if you go back into your Hebrew scriptures, you figure out what they're referencing and go back, they are badly misquoting them in most cases. And so the question becomes then, well, is it they're doing it from memory, right? And they get it a little off because they're doing it from memory? Is it because they're working from a Septuagint manuscript that reads differently because we know the Septuagint manuscripts read differently? Or is it because they're straining to figure out how to make it work and they figured if they swap a word around? The biblical authors are very, very willing to play fast and loose when quoting other parts of the Bible. That's not unique to Hebrews, that's all of them. So be warned, I guess, in general, that if you think it's really important that they quote everything exactly, they don't. And as a sort of aside, there are biblical translations that, looking at that kind of uncomfortable reality, will actually fix the quotations in the manuscripts. So there are certain translations I don't like, because when they see something being quoted and it's not quoted in a way that matches that other spot, they either change the quotation or they change the original line to match the quotation on the assumption that, well, they're closer in time to it, so their quote of it must be more accurate than any of our manuscripts. I think it's better to leave it different, but that's me. So verse 7 references Psalm 8, which there's no little while in Psalm 8, and old manuscripts change some of the words around a bit. Verse 12 and 13 make sort of borderline nonsense references to Psalm 22 and Isaiah 8. There's just little fractions that don't fit into the larger sentences. And verse 14 references the devil, which is interesting because it is in the first century that you really see this sort of crystallization of the concept of the devil. You don't see that in early writings. Paul does not talk much about a devil. Even the Gospels don't talk much because it was not the personalization of the devil as a particular entity that acts contrary to things was not crystallized really until the end of the first century, which helps in dating things like this. We know it's later because they talk about the devil as a particular person that has to be worked against. And you just don't see that in older texts. Now, ultimately, I think the reason we see this reading in Hebrews right after Christmas is because it is talking specifically about incarnation, right? Jesus becoming like us, that Jesus might call us brothers and sisters in order to fulfill the requirements of the atonement. So as we celebrate Christmas, the birth, this is a much kind of higher level theological take on why Jesus has to become a person in the more typical sense. The interesting question I pose, and the reason that I thought it's worth digging into this in great detail, is why. Do we ever think, sometimes I think we get so reflexive about ideas, we stop thinking about why. I imagine all of us as children asked questions, and then we're told, because, listen, do the thing. But sometimes I think it's worth going back through and re-asking, why does Jesus have to be a person in order to accomplish the task set out, right? Because if God just wanted to tell us stuff, well, God's told us stuff through a lot of other people before. What is different and unique in Jesus in this way? What is being accomplished that's different that requires this? And sort of tied to that very explicitly is, therefore, what is the nature of the mission? Like, why does he have to become one of us for the mission? Kind of sets up then, well, what in specific detail is the mission? And I know this is going to get kind of academic, but if we're going to really investigate our beliefs, if we are going to sit and meditate on the mysteries before us, at some point we have to go head-to-head against the ideas that are encapsulated in it so that we can try and wrap our heads around what we're doing. Clearly, these ideas were really important early on. They were not things that could just be kind of accepted based on their inertia, because there was no inertia. They were building that. We don't have to think about these things as much because they were thought about for a long time, and then everyone just sort of came to a conclusion, more or less, and ran with it. But that was not always the case. And we can learn a lot by going back to those old discussions, arguments, let's be honest, arguments, and figure out where it comes from. These are not small issues, either historically or contemporaneously. No matter what I say in here, someone out there will call me a heretic for it, because there are diverse opinions on these things, and no matter what conclusion you hold, you're wrong to somebody. So pick your battles, I guess, and kind of decide where you think fits. But what I want to run through is a history of sort of ideas of Christology, of who Jesus is as an entity, and then we're going to talk a little bit about atonement, right? Because Jesus is this, atonement has to look like this, right? Making us justified before God has to look like this based on who Jesus is, because it matters. Those are the topics in here, and that's what we're going to run through. Now, when we talk about Jesus becoming like us, as the author here in Hebrews does, in what way? Is the question the early church asked. And interestingly, this was one of the original, shattering questions that the early church wrestled with. Because when we talk about the creeds, right, the Nicene Creed, Chalcedon, all these old councils, the purpose of those councils was to establish the nature of Jesus. That's what they were arguing about. They literally went to war with each other in the church over the nature of Jesus. And so this was one of the big deals early on. So we're going to run through theories. It's not quite a historical order. It's sort of simplest to most complicated, I think, is probably the way to go. And what you will find is that ultimately the church throughout history has settled on the most complicated possible option. Which doesn't mean it's wrong, it just means it's got more moving parts to it, which has the benefit of being messier so that you can kind of sweep the rough edges under the rug. So very early on, there was a huge part of Christianity that fell under something called Ebionism. And Ebionism was basically, Jesus is a human. He's just a guy, right? That God decided to empower with a particular set of abilities and responsibilities. He is very much an Elijah or Elisha, Old Testament prophet kind of guy who's given a very particular role by God to accomplish something. That's Ebionism. And there was a significant portion of the early church that held to that, especially in the Mesopotamia area. Um, that didn't sit well with a lot of other people who wanted to look at Jesus and see something more inherently divine. So then the next step up we get is called adoptionism, which is the idea that Jesus was born just a guy, and that God mystically adopts Jesus into divine standing. He is made divine in order, either by virtue of what he did and accomplished and said, or in order to do those things. Kind of either way works. But adoptionism became kind of the next step away from Ebionism that says, well, yeah, he started as just a regular human, but became something different. Then you get the really far end of that spectrum, which is called Docetism, which was much more popular in like Alexandria and a lot of more Greek areas, that said Jesus was never just a biological person. Jesus is a divine entity that was just shaped to look like a person. There was never a biological person there, just God, right? Looking like a person. So those are the three like singular options that come early on that we argue about. He's just a guy, he's just God, he started as this and became this, and then we get into the mixing options. So then you get Apollinarianism. I always feel like there needs to be another syllable in there, but there's not. Apollinarianism is the idea that Jesus is both human and divine, and it's just he's got human bits and divine bits. He's kind of a Frankenstein's monster of human and divine chunks mixed together. All right. So some bits. So if you poke him here, that part might be human, but if you poke him here, you got divine. It's mixed together. It's a little more complicated than that. It's ideas like, well, his will is divine, but his blood is regular human. It's complicated, but that it's both, and that those two things are Legoed together into Jesus. All right. I got two left. I know. Then you get the step from there is miaphysitism, or miaphysitism, which is the idea that there's both human and divine, and they melt together into a singular entity that is both and at the same time and sort of neither. Like bronze, right? You take tin and you take copper and you melt them together and you get bronze. And miaphysitism is that Jesus is both copper and tin melted together into bronze. So he's something sort of unique that has both things in it. That didn't sit well with a lot of early church leadership, because that implies that Jesus is in fact still not like us, right? When so much of this is saying Jesus is like us, you can make the argument Jesus is like us the way the Ebionites said, because he's a guy, or Jesus is like us because he's God shaped to look like us, or he's like us because he's got our parts mixed in with other things, or he's adopted. Miaphysitism is sort of like, well, he's got our parts, but not in any way that we have them. And so that one created problems fairly early on. And there are still miaphysitist, that's a weird one to say, denominations out there in the world, especially in like Eastern Orthodox areas. So there are groups, I should say, there are still groups that believe basically all of these out there. But in terms of ones that have a decent number of people behind them, miaphysitism is still one of the more popular options outside of the one that largely became the dominant view of Christianity in the last one, diophysitism, which is that Jesus is simultaneously human and divine, and that these are separate, distinct entities, but are utterly inseparable. They are kind of co-communal. They exist in some kind of hypostatic union, is the technical term. Which is to say, we've used words to take something that doesn't make sense and say it makes sense. All right? the mystery of the divine. And that's fine. I'm not trying to knock it to say that it can't be mysterious. But diophysitism became the dominant version of Christology throughout Christianity. And it's the core result of things like Nicaea and Chalcedon and those. So when the church was gathering in 325 to establish these, there were some arguments that resulted, but the overarching direction the church went was diophysitism. Jesus is just a guy and God at the same time, but not mixed together, but not separable. This is why those creeds get really long and complicated, right? Because there is a mysterious reality at work in that, is the direction the church went with that. Okay, so now we have a nature of God, of Jesus. The problem we get into, right, when we talk about the mission of Jesus, is who Jesus is makes a big difference, right? Because if you believe that a human has to be the one to take the place of humanity, right, in order to ransom humanity, then you have to believe Jesus has a human nature. Right? Which of these you settle on has implications for how you think what Jesus did works, and therefore where we go with it. So the early church argued about who Jesus was, and strangely, they were really insistent on establishing that. And then they didn't argue a ton about atonement. They kind of let it just assume that there was a basis of what the atonement meant, like what Jesus' sacrifice means, based on who he is. Which is interesting because I have 8 of those that the church has held throughout time. And I think this matters more, personally. I think it matters more what you think Jesus did than the exact language you want to use about who Jesus is. You just, based on who Jesus is, kind of limits your options in what you think he did and could do, right? So when it comes to Jesus being born, we've got Christmas, right? I'll try not to move too much. Jesus coming into the world, does a bunch of stuff, and dies, right? And so the final conclusion of that, the idea of salvation for his followers, the idea of reconciling us with God, all of the language that gets used in here is fundamentally linked up in a concept that academics call the atonement, the idea of getting rid of sin, getting rid of that separation between us and God. The problem is there's a lot of ways to understand that. And these are not mutually exclusive, but people tend to focus really hard on some of them more than others, and it creates problems. So real fast, I want to run through some of the options. All of these are still popular options. Unlike Christology, where the church kind of largely narrowed down to one answer, there are groups out there that believe all of these, sometimes multiple of them simultaneously. But most people in their heads tend to pick one way to frame it. And how you frame it has implications for how you then live out your faith, how you understand what Jesus did and what we're supposed to do. So, real fast, moral influence theory, one of the very earliest, and this fits really well with Ebionism, but that's aside. Moral influence theory basically says Jesus was very much like the older prophets and stuff, in that what Jesus does is teaches us a new way to be, a new way to live, a new way to see the world. And our responsibility then as people is to look at Jesus' teachings and life and practices and try and embody those. And atonement is about that change in us. Right? It is a subjective vision of atonement that says salvation is accomplished by Jesus' moral influence on us, making us into better people. Right? Then you get things like, went to the wrong list, ransom theory, right? This gets talked about a lot. This is really big for John. The idea that in the fall, at some point, humans became captive to sin and death, and in order to get us back, we became enslaved. There's a lot of slavery images around this one. But the idea is because we've been enslaved, or you could say imprisoned, right? Jesus' death on the cross becomes the payment for our release. That's the bail money right there. That Jesus pays to death and sin and evil in order to get us back from being trapped by those things. Then there's Christus Victor, which is a new-ish term for it because historically it was not kind of crystallized in a particular way. But the Christus Victor model is that Jesus didn't die to pay off evil and sin and death and these things. Jesus died to destroy those things. It is sort of the victorious conqueror of death imagery, right? Jesus, in order to defeat evil, Jesus had to encounter evil, right? Live as a person, be tempted by these things, not give in to that evil, not become subsumed by that evil, and then finally encountering the last of evil, which is death. And by not being corrupted by any of it, destroying it all, because it can't exist in the presence of someone that has not fallen prey to it. Christus Victor. This one gets talked about a lot by the early church fathers. It was probably the primary method of understanding the atonement in kind of the early church. They mention all the other ones, like they mention the other stuff, but when it comes to the early church writers really settling on something, that's where most of them go. That Jesus is a victorious conqueror of sin and death and evil by destroying it. That just creates other complicated theological issues like, well, then why do we still have to deal with sin and death and evil in the world if it's been defeated? And that becomes a different theological conversation. Not for today. Then we get those are the three really early ones. And then recapitulation. I have this in a different order, but I'm going to jump up. Recapitulation is popular amongst a couple early church authors, especially like Irenaeus. And the idea is basically that Jesus' life and death is a reversal of the fall in Genesis. Instead of humanity being basically perfect and giving in to sin and death and inviting those things into the world and being corrupted, it is Jesus coming from that corrupted place and living perfectly and undoing what was done in the past. It is a reversal. Once again, more of what Jesus' death and resurrection does isn't as much about subjective in recapitulation, it's about objective. It's about changing the nature of reality, not necessarily just the nature of us and how we act and process the world. Then we get into the later ones, and the later ones became really, really popular, especially in England and now in the Americas and a few other places around the world that we've had our fingers. These come from Anselm, who is an English theologian, is kind of where these really got traction. And that's in the 11th century, so 10th, 11th century. So for about half of Christianity, those were the understandings of what Jesus did, basically. Then we get satisfaction and penal substitution theories in this second half. And this is the idea that our offenses, our sins, the terrible things that we do, offend God so much that it has to be balanced out by some kind of divine repayment, right? So whereas ransom is saying we have been held prisoner by sin and death and evil, and that needs to be paid off, The idea of satisfaction theory is that we owe God for our offenses, and God demands some kind of repayment, and that becomes Jesus. This kind of slides directly into the other one, which is penal substitution, the idea that we deserve death, and somebody has to die on our behalf, that is to be substituted for our death, in order to redeem our lives. And once again, penal substitution is God, in God's justice and goodness, cannot abide our terribleness, and therefore, out of justice, must condemn us to death. Whereas in Jesus, we then have the opportunity to have life. That is penal substitution. And unfortunately, that's like one of the most popular ones these days that I hear all about, despite the fact that it's one of the newer options. Right? We hear people talk about that. The wages of sin is death. The wages of sin is death. Right? The gift of God is eternal life. That's the line. And the problem with all of these is that they're all in here. Like if you highlight the right bits and pieces, you can make this say any of these. The final one is called scapegoat theory, and I love this one. I love this one a whole lot. I think it has its limits, but I think it's also a beautiful reflection of a lot of early church authors, but it really didn't get systematized until the last century. And scapegoat theory is literally the idea that Jesus' death is not demanded by the devil or evil or death. Jesus' death is not demanded by God. Jesus' death is demanded by us. Right? The idea is that in our corrupted insistence on evil, in our cravings for death and destruction and conquest and all of these things, we kill God. Right? And then salvation in that is Jesus becomes the mirror to show us what even our sense of justice. Jesus was killed by justicism, right? He was executed by Roman legal officials for inciting riots, functionally. That our systems of justice, that our systems of values are corrupt and need to be reimagined. That's a newer one, but it fits very much with moral influence, and it has a very Christus Victor, only instead of it's the personal side of Christus Victor. Instead of Jesus destroying death and evil kind of in reality, it's Jesus showing us our own corrupted ways and asking us to work with them. Those are all justifiable ways to view what Jesus did. You can find justification for any of those in here. I promise. I think the arguments for some of them is a whole lot stronger than the arguments for others. But they've all been supported by major church leaders from beginning to today. But what you pick matters. And here's why I think it's really important to reflect on these things and talk about them. And I know I'm taking a long time to do it, but it's because some of these things matter. And I don't want to give you just a little fragment of information that you then have to try and figure out what else is there. What you pick matters, because if you think God, if you are a satisfaction theory believer at heart, and you genuinely think that God is just always looking down at us angrily, waiting to punish us, that is going to influence how you relate to God and how you organize your life in the world, right? Versus, if you think of what Jesus did as just being a positive moral teacher, giving us a different way to live so that we can figure out how to get over all of these terrible things that drag us down, that oppress us, that bring us to oppress each other. Right? They create different systems. in you as a person and the way you relate to the world. And we could line up denominations here and assign them each, and you can look at how they kind of settle on some of these more than others and what that means for how they interact with the world. If you think God is violent, you are not going to have a problem with violence. If you think God is at core instructive and a teacher that lets you do things, you're not, you know what I mean? It matters where you come down. There's some great contemporary theologians. Gregory Boyd has some problematic positions, but I like a lot of his work. Gregory Boyd's position is the churches, collectively, Big C Church, needs to get better about acknowledging all of these and saying all of these are valid interpretations of Jesus' mission, instead of trying to fight over the one correct interpretation. That's Gregory Boyd's position, and he is a fairly conservative theologian by most definitions. I think that's great. I generally encourage that. That's why I tell you all of the things. I give you more options than you generally want, so that they can rattle around in there and make you ask questions. I think that's valid. But part of me struggles with that because I know how bad theology hurts people. Because it does. And so I want to look at it and say, can we acknowledge that they're all there, and then maybe focus on the ones that help us live the way that Jesus encourages us to live? Like, if instead of separating atonement into its own theory and starting there and then trying to build Christian life based off of that, what if we look at the other stories and texts and teachings and be like, well, sure, we can get to all of these, but some of them make us more like this, and some of them don't. I ultimately can't pick for you where you sit. And you are in good company no matter what you internally think has the most logic to it, because there's a lot of people out there for all of them. But I take sides. Jesus takes sides in things. It's not un-Christ-like to take sides. And I think it's worth, no matter where you end up, really carefully reflecting on who is Jesus to you, and what did Jesus do that changed the world in such a way that we're still talking about him today. That's what this comes down to. Christology, atonement theories, all of this is just, how can you understand and connect to the person that is Jesus, and why are you still sitting here today thinking about it? What's the correct answer? Depends on who you ask. But in the wake of Christmas, which, while historically has not been the biggest Christian holiday, but has become that for some reason, because things change over time, in between Christmas and Easter, I guess where we're at in the liturgical calendar, really reflect on these core matters, because they will change your life. They have, and they will. And where you go with that, between you and God. Amen.